pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, October 24th, 2024, the committee is commencing its study on issues and opportunities related to the railroads and railways and agriculture. So as you know, colleagues, we have 5 different witnesses. We've decided to collapse it all into one panel. We'll be going for about an hour and a half today, and we'll get right to it. So first of all, with the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, we have here in the room Drew Spolstra, who is the president, and Jason Bent, who is director of policy research. So gentlemen, thank you so much for your work, and welcome to the committee. From Pulse Canada, we have Terry Yuzwa, who is the chair. Very great to see you in the room as well. Avec les Unions de Producteurs d'Agricole, Stéphanie Levasseur.
With the Union of Farmers, Stéphanie Levasseur, who is the second general vice president, and by video conference, David Touga, coordinator and in business economics. Thank you and welcome.
Grain Elevator Association, Wade Sokovich, the executive director, joining us by a video conference. So, colleagues, as you know the drill, we're going to start with 5-minute opening remarks from each witness, and then we'll get into questions. I expect we should be able to do about what I would call 2 full rounds. So, 3 rounds for the Conservatives, 3 for the Liberals, and 2 for the NDP and the Bloc. I'd also like to recognize Ms. Sidhu, who is joining in on the committee. Great to have you here. Et Monsieur Balderis, bienvenue au nom de Monsieur McGregor, ou peut-être Cannings aussi.
Welcome, Mr. Boulris, on behalf of Mr. McGregor and Mr. Cannings. And Mr. Epp is also sitting in for Mr. Lehoux.
Agriculture, Mr. Spolstra, you have up to 5 minutes. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food. Thanks for the opportunity to address the committee as part of your study into the issues and opportunities related to railways. My name is Drew Spolstra, and I'm the president of the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, and I farm near Hamilton with my family. And with me today is Jason Bent, OFA's Director of Policy Research. We represent over 38,000 farm families across Ontario and are committed to advocating for the interests of our members and the broader agri-food industry. Ontario farmers face significant challenges as railways look to offload costs onto them. These challenges center on 2 main focus areas. First, the costs related to safety upgrades for private railway crossings, and second, the issue of drainage infrastructure. Many Ontario farmers depend on private railway crossings to access their fields. These crossings are vital for transporting equipment, supplies, and produce, ensuring that landowners can reach their own property that was once divided by the railways. Safety is critical to both railway users and those needing to cross the railway tracks. However, new safety regulations under the grade crossing regulations, which railways must comply with by November 28th of this month, will put enormous financial burden on some farmers. Upgrade costs greatly vary depending on what's needed for each crossing. Some of our members with private railway crossings have recently received letters from CN Rail informing them that unless an exemption to the regulatory requirements is granted, their crossing will need to undergo mandated upgrades that will include the installation of an automated warning system with gates. In the letter, CN Rail provides the estimate that necessary cost upgrades will cost each private railway crossing owner between $600,000 and $2 million, depending on the cost of installation for each automated gate system. In addition to the annual maintenance costs of $9,685 for the equipment, the excessive costs of these regulatory required upgrades will result in the closure of some private crossings. Without such alternatives, some property owners will have no choice but to lose access to their landlocked portions of their properties. We understand that CN Rail is currently pursuing options with the regulator to seek a regulatory exemption for some specific crossings, where CN Rail believes that cost-effective alternative measures could be implemented that would provide the same level of safety. While we support CN Rail's efforts to seek lower costs for safety alternatives for these crossings, the question remains, who pays the costs for the upgrades? Depending on the crossings, some railways are pushing farmers to bear the upgraded costs by imposing new agreements. These unilateral agreements not only shift costs onto farmers, but also threaten to destabilize long-standing agreements. In some cases, farmers are even receiving 30-day notices to close crossings or worse, find their crossings removed without notice. OFA believes an immediate moratorium on the unilateral closing of private railway crossings is urgently needed. Additionally, railways must continue to honor their past long-standing obligations to manage maintenance and upgrades at their own expense. And we support the efforts of railways like CN to seek reasonable safety alternatives for crossings. Looking now at drainage, the shift in cost responsibilities is not limited to railway crossings. Railways are now backing out of their obligations under Ontario's Drainage Act, which distributes drainage costs based on the area of land drained. Proper drainage is critical for farmland, ensuring that soils remain productive by preventing waterlogging and flooding. Historically, railways have paid municipal drain assessments, but they now refuse to do so, citing their federal regulation status as grounds for exemption. This refusal means that millions of dollars in drainage costs could fall on farmers and rural municipalities instead. Our position is that railways should remain responsible for these drainage costs, consistent with their historical obligations under Ontario's Drainage Act. In support of this, OFA has applied for intervenor status in the legal challenge between the municipality of Chatham-Kent and the Canadian Pacific Railway. We're also requesting that federal amendments to Canada's Transportation Act to clarify that railways must honor such provincial legislation. In conclusion, these sudden and unilateral cost shifts are simply unacceptable. Farmers are already under intense financial strain from rising input costs, climate challenges, and market instability. Imposing unexpected financial burdens undermines the stability of agreements that farmers rely on, impacting their mental health, productivity, and ultimately their livelihoods. OFA urges the federal government to act swiftly on the following points. Impose an immediate moratorium on the closure of private railway crossings. Reinforce the railway responsibility to bear the cost of necessary upgrades and maintenance for private railway crossings, as they have done in the past. Prevent unilateral agreements imposing new contracts that shift maintenance costs and upgrades to landowners. Secure government funding. Fully fund the Railway Safety Improvement Program to support farmers with compliance costs for safety upgrades. The deadline, of course, is fast approaching, as I mentioned, and immediate action is critical to prevent these costs from falling on farmers. And legislative amendments to the Canadian Transportation Act to prevent railways from shifting costs historically covered by the railways. Ontario farmers provide essential services that support our economy and feed Canadians. We urge this committee to support policies that ensure fair, stable terms for farmers, enabling them to continue producing food while safeguarding their financial and mental well-being. Thank you for your attention to these urgent issues. We look forward to working together to secure a viable solution for Ontario farmers and rural communities.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spolstra. We'll now turn to Pulse Canada. Mr. Yuswa, over to you for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the committee for its invitation to appear this morning. I'm Terry Yuswa, and I'm chair at Pulse Canada. Pulse Canada is the national association representing over 26,000 pulse growers, as well as the processors and exporters of Canadian pulse crops, including peas, lentils, chickpeas, dry beans, and fabas. I'm a farmer from Nipawin, Saskatchewan, where I grow canola, wheat, oats, peas, faba beans, and canary seed along with my son. Canada is the world's largest exporter of pulse crops. Every year we send billions of dollars worth of pulses to over 120 markets around the world, and to do this economically, Canada's pulse industry and the entirety of Canadian agriculture relies on a well-functioning supply chain. And for crops like mine to make it to ports and onto dinner plates in markets around the world, they first rely on timely, predictable rail service. The lack of competition available results in unreliable and unpredictable service for shippers. For farmers in Saskatchewan, where there's only one rail carrier that serves their region effectively, creating a monopoly. In fact, 94% of grain elevators are beholden to one single carrier. That is why Pulse Canada advocates for measures that not only make our system more efficient, but also increase competition. Key among these measures is extended regulated interswitching. Pulse Canada has long been an advocate for this policy, dating back a decade. It has been positive to see parties of all stripes recognize the pro-competitive value of extended interswitching and the positive economic benefits that competition delivers. Farmers like me bear the costs of a supply chain that isn't performing, and you can see it in our yard. Higher levels of inventory, increased storage costs, and additional interest charges, wider bases and lower prices. That's what an underperforming supply chain means to me. But there's more to it than the cost of storing more grain for longer periods of time. For pulse growers, a good deal of the product moves by container. When the supply chain that moves product from Saskatchewan through to transloaders in Vancouver is failing, it has an even bigger impact on our bottom line. Poor rail car order fulfillment and unpredictable service through to Vancouver creates delays. Delays often result in demurrage charges and container detention fees. And if cars and containers aren't getting unloaded and loaded at port on time, we're missing the vessel that we booked to ship our pulses to the customer overseas. And missing shipment windows leads to price penalties that's built into the standard contract. Because it's all too common for our industry to experience these kinds of problems, companies often have to switch to more expensive transportation modes or widen shipping windows to mitigate risks, which only further reduces profitability and increases costs. These added costs can't be passed on to the customer because we're competing against the Aussies and new producers throughout the Black Sea region. So most of these costs have to be passed down to growers. We see these costs in the form of reduced prices and higher risk premiums. The bottom line for me as a grower is that we need a system that offers more cars, better rates, and better service. And to get there, we need competition. The pilot that ran from 14 to 17 and the one currently running shows that extended interswitching works. Even when traffic isn't switched over to another carrier, I understand that extended interswitching is encouraging the originating carrier to do what it can to win the business. They offer the cars and match the rates. That's competition, and we should expect nothing less every day in our rail freight system. Mr. Chair, competition will put the right cars in the right place at the right time and at the right price. And when that's happening, we'll reduce the need to absorb penalties, to pay for costly workarounds like changing transportation modes or extending shipping windows. And those benefits accrue back to the Canadian supply chain, which creates better outcomes for farmers like me. It's time to take the 160-kilometer extended interswitching pilot and make it permanent. In fact, to include all growers on the prairies, a range of 500 kilometers should be considered so the growers can take full advantage of increased competition. There's no reason to study it further. Let's do it and get on with the business of growing our economy. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Uswa. Maintenant, avec UPA, peut-être Madame Levasseur, s'il vous plaît. For 5 minutes.
For 5 minutes, from the Union des Producteurs Agricoles, Ms. Stéphanie Levasseur, thank you for having us today. My name is Stéphanie Levasseur, and I'm happy to be here as an apple producer farmer from Fredericksburg in the south of Quebec, and also as the second vice president of the Union des Producteurs Agricoles, which brings together 42,000 farmers and producers operating 29,000 farms across Quebec. We represent all sectors of production, both national and international and local. So the economic contribution of agriculture and forestry is undeniable. In 2023, these businesses generated total farm cash receipts of $13 billion, making agriculture the most important primary sector activity in Quebec. What's more, according to a study produced by our economists in 2022, the agricultural sector's growth potential was estimated at 23% by 2030, or 4% more than the Quebec economy as a whole. These figures clearly demonstrate the importance of agriculture and the consequences that certain decisions can have on this vital sector of our economy. About bringing level crossings up to standard, I'd like to address concerns. So on November 28th, in less than 3 weeks, all grade crossings under federal jurisdiction will have to comply with the grade cross regulations, and the CN has identified a limited number of private crossings requiring major investment to bring them up to standard. In accordance with current regulations, these costs will have to be borne by the producers who use these crossings. As we've said, the estimated costs range from $600,000 to $2 million for each crossing, plus an annual maintenance fee of about $10,000 for the equipment. Of course, you'll understand that these amounts far exceed the financial capacity of the farmers concerned. In the absence of viable solutions, the only option could be to close these crossings, which would render part of the agricultural and forest land of the owners concerned completely inaccessible. Such a situation would be unacceptable and would cause considerable harm to the affected producers and farmers. CN informs us that with the help of experts in the field, it has identified alternative measures with equivalent safety benefits and substantially lower costs on several private crossings in agricultural areas. In light of this information, our union, just like the Ontario Federation of Agriculture and more, and the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, support the CN to obtain regulatory exemptions for these crossings. These exemptions are all the more critical as the Railway Safety Improvement Program has not been accepting new proposals since 2022 for projects to improve rail safety at level crossings and along railroad lines. While we strongly encourage the Government of Canada to recapitalize the RSIP to cover the costs of upgrading, maintaining and modifying private crossings, we are aware that any new funding will not be available in time to meet the November 28th deadline, which is why it is important to grant regulatory exemptions. I'd also like to draw your attention to the crucial importance of maintaining smooth, efficient railway services for the transport of agri-food products, including agricultural production inputs such as seeds, fertilizers, and equipment. Rail disruptions are a strategic issue for the agriculture and agri-food sector. Delays in the delivery of our agricultural products have serious consequences for farm businesses and, by extension, for the agri-food industry as a whole, not to mention the direct impact on consumers. A case in point is the agricultural propane crisis that took place in Quebec in November 2019. At the time, a strike led to an interruption of railway transport in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada. As a result, the supply of propane, essential for a number of agricultural uses, including grain drying at harvest time, was severely disrupted. This propane shortage hit Quebec farmers particularly hard, and that crisis revealed Quebec agriculture's heavy dependence on rail transport for propane supplies and raised questions about the resilience of the supply chain. During the pandemic, we saw just how much our resilience depends on a stable, reliable supply chain. The agricultural sector is already facing financial and climate changes, and it cannot afford to have its access to rail transport compromised. The current situation calls for urgent measures to ensure that the transport of essential goods, particularly those linked to agriculture, is protected and prioritized. In conclusion, we applaud the initiative of the members of this committee in addressing this issue. We hope that the committee's recommendations will help adapt current regulations and programs to the realities of today's Canadian society. Thank you, Ms. Levasseur. Now on to Mr. Sokovich for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thanks for having the Western Grain Elevator Association appear on this very important subject. The WGEA is a national association of grain companies that handle over 95% of Canada's bulk grain exports. Grain shipments account for roughly 20% of the railway revenue, meaning that Canada's major carriers make $1 out of every $5 they earn from the grain sector. Our members represent an even larger portion of total cargo volume in Canada's largest ports, including Vancouver, Thunder Bay, Hamilton, and Montreal. Having cost-effective and efficient rail service is fundamental to the success of Canada's grain supply chain. Alongside many of our farmer and grain processor partners, the WGEA has for decades advocated for improvements in rail-related legislation. I've personally been employed by the WGEA for 27 years, and we've been working on rail legislation improvements that entire time. And so there are a number of items that we are advocating for, and we've been trying to get into the Canada Transportation Act, and I'm going to list some of them. One is to see the railways pay reciprocal penalties when they fail to deliver shipments on time. Right now, they charge grain companies for failing to load trains within a 24-hour period or some similar period. And but there is no discipline on the railways for failure to bring a train or to deliver a train when they say they're going to. So we think reciprocity is required in that area. The second area of advocacy is to retain the maximum revenue entitlement to prevent railway rates from falling on the shoulders of farms, essentially. The third is to turn the grain and winter plans into useful tools of accountability, and I could expand on that later if required. The fourth one is to end the practice of so-called contracting out, which is where the railways get shippers to sign away their rights under the Canada Transportation Act. That happens today. The fifth one is to improve on the cumbersome and ineffectual remedies through the Canada Transportation Agency, among other policy ideas. And so these are all very important concepts that deserve to be considered. But the sixth one, the one I'll talk about for the remainder of my time, is extended interswitching. And Terry explained this. It's an ideal example of low-hanging fruit, and it provides meaningful competition on rail rates and service for shippers that are captive to one of the two primary rail networks. Extended interswitching is one of the only policy tools that has actually caused Canada's two rail monopolies, and we call them dual monopolies as opposed to duopolies, because if you're positioned on a rail line, you don't have the choice between one or the other. So they're dual monopolies. It causes them to compete with one another for shipper business. And not only does it offer an alternative service provider, but it encourages the originating carrier to offer better service or pricing than they otherwise would. Canada had extended interswitching in place from 2014 to 2017, which was prompted by railway failures, catastrophic railway failures in 2013. And at that time, Canada's railways voiced strenuous objections to extended interswitching on the grounds that it would cause major operational challenges and economic hardship on their companies. Time would reveal that Class 1 railway profitability in that 4-year period, based on their operating ratios, was the best it had been over the previous decade. And we know the railways are very active right now in advocating against extending or renewing extended interswitching. So more recently, the pilot trial to increase the regulated interswitching limit in the prairies was once again adopted under Budget 2023, and it's been in place since September 2023. But it was granted a very short timeline of 18 months, which, for a variety of reasons I can expand on, has made it very difficult to use. At its core, extended interswitching gives shippers on a single line the option to call in another railway to get product to market within the extended distance, which is 160 kilometers under the pilot. Poor rail service is often the result of underinvestment by the railway companies. In order to compete with one another, though, they would have to deploy more resources, which means hiring more people. The fact is, extended interswitching will create more jobs in Canada. The threat of loss of business causes the railways to sharpen their pencils on freight rates, which is factored into the cost of goods to Canadians, and it affects our competitiveness globally. The Canadian Transportation Agency ensures railways are fully compensated for their actual costs plus a margin of profit under regulated interswitching. It also provides for other options. One of these options is to provide quicker and more direct routes for the movement of goods. This reduces costs for shippers and therefore consumers. It also frees up rail capacity to help get product to customers in a timely way. Extended interswitching essentially turns a monopoly market into a duopoly situation, which isn't fantastic, but at least it's not a monopoly. Even if an interswitch does not physically happen, the presence of another option changes railway behavior. In fact, that's the real value of extended interswitching. It brings the primary carrier to the table. The intent of extended interswitching is to give all captive shippers at least one competitive option. For that to happen in the grain sector, as Terry mentioned, extended interswitching distance would need to be 500 kilometers to allow for the Peace River and Carrot River growing regions to participate. It's a vital tool for Canadian shippers that's proven to increase competition while lowering costs to shippers and consumers. It should be a permanent right for all Canadian shippers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to the witnesses. We'll now start with questions. I think Mr. Barlow is going to lead us off for up to 6 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. And just before I start with my questions, I just wanted to put on notice a motion that I hope we can discuss on Tuesday. and that motion will read, given that the Minister of Agriculture confirmed he did not know the capital gains tax hike was in Budget 2024, no consultation was completed by the Minister of Agriculture with the agriculture sector, and the concerning and heartbreaking testimony we've certainly heard from committee, that committee has heard on the impact the capital gains tax hike will have on farm families, that this committee hold at least 4 additional meetings on this study of intergenerational transfer of farms and new entrants. So I'm hoping we can discuss that on Tuesday. Certainly as a result of the testimony we've had thus far on this issue, I think it warrants additional study. Now to this one at hand. Mr. Spolstra, thanks very much for your testimony here, as well as Mr. Yuza on these crossings. When Transport Canada made the change to the grade crossing regulations in 2022, that basically there was no difference between a private crossing and a public crossing, was there any consultation from the government department with OFA or Pulse Canada?
Thanks for the question, MP Barlow. And to my knowledge, no, there was no consultation with our organization, but we have since been following up with Transport Canada on the concerns that our members are facing around the province with private level crossings, and ensuring that they have the support they need to go forward and maintain those crossings with the costs being associated to the railways.
I think you want to talk to Stephanie on this one. We didn't speak to private crossings, but it's certainly important for a farmer to access his own land in a reasonable manner. And we haven't looked at that.
To my knowledge, no, we weren't consulted. And at the time, though, the program was still in effect. There was still money in the program for safety upgrades, but the money ran out and it hasn't been renewed since. So everybody that could get up to standard in that year did, but everybody else fell at the end of the bridge. So.
I want to be sure that folks understand what we're talking about here when we're talking about these rail crossings on farm. These are not rail crossings at public roadways or highways or anything along that line. These are remote, in most cases, rail crossings where you would be moving farm equipment maybe once or twice a year from one parcel to another, where more than likely the only people using this crossing would be the landowner or the farmer. Correct? Am I right on that? So going back to the 1800s when the railway was built, have there been any concerns raised in terms of the safety to the public on these railway crossings? Was there an outcry that to Transport Canada that these crossings needed to be upgraded?
Pas à ma connaissance, et effectivement, c'est des.
Not that I know of. And of course, these are railway crossings that are on private land. They're only used by owners who are farmers or their employees who are crossing in order to work in the land on the other side. In the 1800s, probably there was some forests. There were some forests, and maybe they were not really being used, and so there were less problems. But since then, they have been, set up for crops and harvesting. And now these railway crossings are used exclusively by owners to access their own land that are on the other side of the railway. But I have not heard of any issues with regards to accidents or near misses, for example, not with the owners or anyone else.
Sure. Well, we're certainly not aware of many, if any, challenges from around Ontario or, the rest of the country that we've seen with farm equipment crossing the railway tracks. But certainly safety is of utmost concern to all of our members and to the railways. We want to make sure that our crossings are safe and that farmers have reasonable access to those things, as you mentioned, in a minimal amount of times a year. There have been changes, obviously, to the speed and frequency of trains, also to the size of farm equipment and things like that. So as time evolves, I'm sure there's more focus on ways that crossings are changing and evolving. But as you mentioned, these agreements go back to, the late 1800s when the railways cut these farms in half. And we want to see these agreements honored going forward in the future.
Thank you. I just want to switch gears now to maybe Mr. Yuzwa or to Wade. I know that the ask is for the interswitching pilot that ends later this spring to be extended by 30 months. Wade, as you mentioned, we had the Fair Rail for Grain Farmers Act in 2014 to 2017. Clearly showed that extended interswitching works. It resolved a problem, as you termed, catastrophic. So that was a move by the previous Conservative government. I'm curious of why the ask to extend the pilot for another 30 months when I think it's proven that this works. Why not just ask for this to be made permanent?
So unfortunately, we're at time, but I'll try to manage you a little bit better moving forward, John. But just 20 or 30 seconds, if we could, Mr. Sokovich. Yeah, it's a tough job. Yeah.
Yeah, it should be made permanent. I mean, the ask for 30 months is simply reading the tea leaves in terms of what's within the art of the possible, but permanency is the goal here. I mean, it should be an as of right provision. An access to competition, at least one other competitive alternative should be a permanent as of right provision.
Thank you very much. Mr. Drouin, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for being here. I'll start with OFA, Mr. Spoelstra. Thanks for coming before us. Just on the private crossings, and those consultations started and we're talking way back in 2014, and the delay of implementation of those regulations, I think that's what was in question after. My question to you is, your members have received letters from CN and CP. When did they receive those letters? Did they receive those letters a year ago, or we're talking just months ago?
The letters that I'm aware of, they received this past July. And so those letters that were received were July 2nd, I think is the date, regarding upcoming requirements for the crossings, and basically issued an ultimatum that they're either upgraded at the farmer's cost or they're removed.
Okay, and I know CN has offered is trying to get an exemption, and I think Jason has been in touch with Transport Canada to, I understand public crossings where there may be 100 cars per minute, but on the farm it might be 5-10 crossings per year, and obviously the level of safety I don't think needs to be the same, so blowing a whistle might suffice enough to know that there's a train coming. And obviously, $600,000 to $2 million is unacceptable to be. I don't want to farmed out to the farmer. That's completely unacceptable. But thanks for coming here, and I know that we're trying to find a reasonable solution because I think again, the invoice is just ça passe pas, as we say in French. Just on interswitching,
It's just not going to pass, as we say in French.
It requires a legislative change. For 6 weeks now, nothing has moved in the House. So my plea to you is call your local members, and I don't want to make this partisan, but say that we've heard all the MPs who spoke on SDTC, that we've heard them loud and clear, but we got to get back to the business of the House, because if we don't have enough time to legislate interswitching, there will be a gap after March. There will be a gap, and I'm trying to reduce that gap. And if we don't get it through the fall economic statement, then we are stuck. The Minister of Transport is going to have to go to the House Leader and present a bill, and that requires time, and time is extremely sacred in the House. So my plea to you is send letters, and my second plea to you on interswitching. I would say that I haven't heard from you guys on whether or not interswitching works well. But that's good news. I only hear when it doesn't work well. So I would urge you and your organizations to send a letter to the Minister of Transportation to say why interswitching has worked well from you guys, because I can rest assured that the other side is definitely sending letters as to why they shouldn't extend interswitching. So my advice to you, Mr. Yusa, you've mentioned that in your opening remarks, interswitching has worked well. And can you explain to this committee why you're talking to shippers, you're talking to farmers, but ever since this has been implemented, you have seen a better service from rail service, right?
So we're price takers in a global market.
Right.
Every time we're far from port, every time there's a disruption, it comes out of our bottom line. If we don't find ways to be innovative, we're faced with diminished returns, which eventually leads to losses. So data collected during that period showed that $5.3 million was saved by grain companies who used the extended interswitching regulations. For an example, a routing from Lethbridge to Stockton, California, using a CP routing, we pay by ton mile, through Vancouver would require a routing distance of approximately 2,790 kilometers, whereas a BNSF routing would be approximately 2,145 kilometers, a reduction of 23% in route miles. So it's not rocket science. It's there and it's real.
Yep.
That's a 23% gain. That's just one example. So even when it doesn't actually move by the other carrier, the threat of it moving to the other carrier lowers the price. We have to find ways to be innovative in order to remain competitive.
Absolutely, 100%. Madame Levasseur, juste sur les passages à niveau au Québec, puis avec...
Ms. Levasseur, I have a question about the railway crossings in Quebec among your members. How many members have been affected? Have you done any analyses? Over the last 18 months, we've received many requests. We have managed to have a friendly agreement for most of them, but we have about 5 major cases in Quebec that are outstanding and that are going to incur the costs we've talked about. Is it the same thing for the members in Ontario? Members received a letter in June saying you'll be receiving an invoice of $500,000 soon. Indeed, they did receive these letters of offers with new agreements this summer, telling them that they would be responsible for insurance fees and the cost of any work done. Can we have that in written format if it respects the privacy?
To respect privacy, but I'd love to just make sure that we can give that to the minister. Thank you. Thank you so much. Merci.
Maintenant, Monsieur Parent.
Now on to Mr. Perron for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us. Ms. Levasseur, in your opening remarks, you talked about a program that is over, a program that was put in place, and I'm trying to understand here what the situation is with that program. So if you'll allow me, in order to answer, I would ask David. He is probably more aware of the details. So that is a long-term program, but I can't tell you how long it's been around. It was used by municipalities, and it was accessible to private owners for the railway crossings. But there have been some funds that have been available for that have been unavailable for a few months. When the companies need to do, updating, when they need to update the railways, they move that invoice over to the farmers. So correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm not mistaken, there was a program in place to update these grade crossings, but now the standards have increased and the program no longer exists. So the program existed when you didn't need it, and now that you need it, it's no longer there. Do you have any comments on that? You said it all. So that's one of your recommendations. Now, what is the justification that is given to you when you're told that as of November 28th, you'll have new requirements that are imposed on you to, cross your own land with a tractor, for example? Well, it's a perfect example, actually, of a blanket regulation. No time was taken to assess the risks in on public roads versus on private roads. There's, of course, no traffic really from the public on our lands. It's really on these lands. It's really used by just the owner. So the regulation is kind of a blanket regulation, is applicable to all situations, but no means were taken to adapt it to specific situations. So that might also be a recommendation to, review this and modify the requirements in an intelligent way. Well, that's what we were talking about earlier. We talked about alternative measures or alternative ways of addressing these updates, whether it be using a whistle, or earlier before coming in, we were talking about, how can one follow planes in the air worldwide, but on our phones we can't see if a train is coming. There are ways with today's technology to find solutions and to improve the visibility, for example, of trains, to remove vegetation on a larger swath of land, close to the level crossing. There's a lot of things that we can do to improve safety without necessarily having, fences and lights, and doing this in the middle of a field, a farm field. As far as you know, have there been many accidents at these crossings on farmlands? Is there any justification for this kind of measure? Well, David would be able to tell you, but as far as I know, no, there have been no accidents in recent years between a train and a farmer. With regards to the responsibility, I have a question. Many people have asked this question. Of course, a farmer is not necessarily responsible for what the railway is responsible for. There's a difference. Has the distinction always existed where you separate the land, split the land into two? And do you think it's reasonable that all of a sudden we're imposing fees on the farmer? I don't know if I understood your first question, but the second question, those fees have always existed. Even in the 70s, that's how, in the 1800s, that's how it was. These things have not changed over time. Like a lot of old regulation that have become obsolete, they've just never been up to date. And now here we are with this problem. Can you please repeat your first question and explain what you meant with that distinction? Here's what I meant. When you read what's written, it says that if the land is split in half, then the farmer incurs the cost. And if it doesn't split the land in half, then it's the railway carrier. Mr. Boulris for 6 minutes. Thank you to the chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today for this very important study. I have to say that I am from Montreal. I'm from Rosemont Petite Patrie. I need these railway crossings in order to ensure the safety of my citizens. It's a completely different reality from what you're going through. But I do think that this is very fascinating and I'm learning a lot. So updating railway crossings on your land, that financial responsibility and burden is incurred by the people you represent because of a 19th century regulation that was never updated. So railway companies in Canada have a lot of power. It's crazy. Ms. Levasseur, you mentioned that there are 5 cases in Quebec that are unresolved, and the costs can be anywhere between $600,000 and $2 million each time. What is the impact on the survival of certain farms whose members you represent. I don't know the names of each of these farmers. In Quebec, more than half of our members earns less than $100,000 per year. So a $600,000 to $2 million invoice to update as a railway that is not even as big as this room, in order to use it 10 to 15 times a year, that is a pretty exorbitant amount of money. It could lead to, just losing access to the land on the other side entirely, because you might not have the ability to pay for that, nor be able to even reimburse a loan to undertake that work. With regard, depending on when it's located, sometimes it's a small piece of land, sometimes it's a bigger piece of land that's on the other side. So as you said, this is blanket regulation that does not take into consideration the reality of the people that you represent and that of farmers. You asked, why don't we have technology that tells us whether a train is coming or not? In urban settings, the reality is completely different. And as you said, there haven't even been any accidents where you are. We do have a question with regards to Mr. Spolstra. I'm just wondering how much it costs for your members.
Well, thanks for the question. The costs are the same as for those in Quebec, especially for private railway crossings. We're seeing costs, though, that are exorbitant for the drainage costs as well, with the railways trying to advocate their responsibility around covering those costs to drain the railways. It's not only drainage of our farm properties as well, the drainage around the railway tracks, the system underneath them, it needs the drainage system to work well as well. So this is an opportunity for railways, for municipalities, for farmers to come together, and that's how the Ontario Drainage Act works. The people that are using the system pay for the costs. That includes the railways. So we want to make sure that the agreements from the early 20th century are all met and continue on into the future.
Je vais revenir à M. Sokovic, mais vous avez parlé de...
Back to Mr. Sokovic. You talked about a type of dual monopoly. I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do you think of Canadian railway companies' attitude, what is your relationship like with those two major players? Mr. Sokovic first, please.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for the question. So because we're beholden to monopolies, if you're an elevator and you're planted in the middle of Saskatchewan and you have, a CN line or a CPKC line running past you, you're beholden to a monopoly. So you are shipping on the terms that are dictated by the railway. And so what we're looking for are legislative measures that try and rebalance that relationship, try and make it into a more commercial relationship, the type of relationship you'd find if it were a competitive environment. It's about supply chains, and supply chains are about the economy. And it's very, very important, that more important now than ever, that we do everything in our power to get product to our customers in a timely way. We suffer reputational damage. We suffer costs. We are not taking advantage of opportunities. We're not able to return as many foreign dollars into the Canadian economy for the product that we grow and that we export. And so that relationship is very imbalanced right now. Extended interswitching would provide sort of one tool, but we need more tools than extended interswitching. We need reciprocal penalties. We need, other measures in the Canada Transportation Act to try and help rebalance that relationship so that there's more of a equal bargaining power when the railway and the grain elevators sit down to discuss and agree on the terms of service, that they're doing so from sort of as equal partners in that commercial relationship, not as, where the railway is dictating terms of service essentially to the grain company. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Mr. Sarkovich and Mr. Bolaris. We're at time. We'll go to Mr. Epp now for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. As a past processing tomato grower, I've had the chance to go to California many, many times, and there's an expression that comes from that state that says, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting over. And the province of Ontario has been around a long time. They addressed that, albeit from the opposite perspective, not from access to water like California, but from the drainage of water. And the Ontario Drainage Act is the oldest act in the province of Ontario. And for 100 years, both railways respected that act. So I'd like to begin with UFA, Mr. Spolstra. Why do you believe that in the last 5 years, both railways now seem to be challenging an act that they respected for over 100 years? My own municipality of Chatham-Kent has the most bridges, largely over drains, and municipality of Perth East, CN is being sued there. My municipality is suing CPKC. Why?
Well, I think Jason may have some comments on this as well, but thanks for the question. I think largely everyone is seeing increased costs on their operations, thanks to inflation, thanks to some other challenges as well. But farmers are certainly bearing the brunt of a lot of the inflationary pressures on our industries. Crop inputs are higher. All the other things that we have to deal with are higher. So I'm sure the railways are no different, and they're looking for ways to spread out those costs. There are historical agreements in place. We want to make sure they're honored. We want to make sure that farmers are supported in these efforts. And when it comes to the Ontario Drainage Act, these costs have to be covered by the people that are using them. As I mentioned, municipalities are covering a portion of those costs. The railways should cover their portion of the costs, and the farmers do their best to cover their portion of the costs as well. Thank you. Anything to add, Jason?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And certainly the railways are hanging their hat on the fact that they are federally regulated. And in their minds, that means they don't have to comply with, adhere to the laws of the land where that crossing or where that drainage work is situated, or crossing in that case.
Thank you. In doing some digging, because it doesn't affect my municipality at home, I guess it was 1996 that the Railway Act was repealed and replaced by provisions kind of split into both the Canadian Transportation Act and into the Railway Safety Act. And so is it your understanding that the government of the time intended to change the policy around drainage and the effect on or the opportunity for railways? Because I find it a little bit odd that that was changed back in the late 90s. Then all of a sudden, about 5 years ago, both of our national railways appear to now challenge it. Comment, please.
And thanks for that question, and pointing out that the Railway Act was repealed and replaced, and there was provisions in the Railway Act that contained a clause that required railways to abide by provincial drainage legislation with some conditions. And that's why our request is that we do need to amend the Canada Transportation Act to include those types of provisions, to basically direct the Canada Transportation Agency to consider provincial drainage legislation when and their past rulings when a matter is brought forward to them.
I have had a chance to meet with the railways exactly on this issue. Their claim now is that after 100 years, all of a sudden they are taking care of their own water. And I find that as a farmer and one who's been involved with the Drainage Act many times over the years, a bit incredulous because last time I checked, water still flows downhill and has to go somewhere. So what is the effect if they are successful in avoiding paying costs into the drainage schemes? Can you explain again? I think Mr. Spolster began. How does the costs around cleaning a drain or putting up a bridge, replacing a bridge? How does that work for all those affected?
Well, the effect is if the railways are deemed not responsible for the cost of their drainage, those costs are going to be shifted onto farmers and municipalities. And so, we know that farmers are already facing exorbitant costs from some of these other challenges as well. Municipalities are having their own set of challenges with affording some of these costs and passing those costs on to taxpayers. And so ultimately, taxpayers across municipalities are going to be responsible for a bigger portion of the costs.
Thank you. I normally take all my time plus, but I'll cede a few seconds back.
you'll get on my Christmas card list then this year, Mr. Epp. We'll go to Mr. Lewis for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank all the witnesses here. We're talking about railway as infrastructure, and just in general, infrastructure is very important in Kitchener-Conestoga, and specifically roads and bridges. We mentioned infrastructure that's not used much. Railway crossings not used much. Roads and bridges not used often. But it's specifically important because I've got Mennonite community using horses and buggies. So when we're talking about a bridge or a road that needs to be closed, and we'll have to drive a few minutes down the road, our Mennonite community has extra challenges of doing that. So I appreciate this conversation. And we're trying to balance here the safety with practicality. But I do want to point out that we're talking about private railway crossings, not public crossings. And these are crossings that are used by the farmers themselves and also not that often. So I would direct my questions to Mr. Spolstra from OFA. You mentioned that the costs that could be passed down to the farmers, $600,000 to $2 million per farm, if we can't find cost-effective measures to do. Farmers can't afford a bill like that. That's going to cost them money, or in the case Madame said, having to go around, it would cost them time, which is also money. In my region, Waterloo, there's 15 private and farm crossings on CN line and 12 on the CP line, and we even have 9 on a smaller Elmira line. So this is something that absolutely affects us in Waterloo region. So can you explain how we can either make the railways pay for these changes, or how we can change the process of how a train passes through private lands? What kind of mechanisms can we enforce?
Well, to the second part, I'm not sure there's any way to really change the process on how the train passes through, other than looking at alternatives for safety. So whether there are ways to track the train, I think we've chatted about that already. Maybe there's opportunities to blow the horn more frequently when they're coming up to some of these private crossings. The private crossings themselves, as you mentioned, are absolutely critical for farmers, for other parts of the community as well. These crossings are in place because once upon a time the railway cut the farms in half, and so for the good of the rest of the country, putting the railways in place also meant having these access to these crossings for the farmers that needed them. I think we outlined a few of the things that we think are possible for the government to move forward with. Imposing an immediate moratorium on the closure of railway crossings is important for us. Reinforcing that the upgrades to these crossings, as well as the drainage issues, are the responsibility of the railway. Preventing unilateral agreements or imposing shifts that shifts the maintenance and cost upgrades to landowners. Funding the program for the Railway Safety Improvement Program is important, so that municipalities have access to funding to make these improvements. Farmers have access as well. And then working on legislative amendments to the Transportation Act to prevent railways from shifting these costs that are historically covered by the railways themselves.
That's one of the things that I appreciate you being here and having this discussion. If we were to talk about the Drainage Act again, I know you've said it before, but it just helps to get it on record again, that you mentioned that the people that are using the system pay the cost, and the railways are using the system. So can you just expand on how they need to pay their share?
Absolutely. So that's the way the system works. The users of the system pay the costs, and I think for a number of years it's worked very successfully. The railways, they're not immune to drainage issues. Just because they might be up on a raised platform, there still needs to be drainage around them. The water still needs to get away. The water still needs to flow underneath railways so that they don't erode and cause issues with the infrastructure underneath them. So they're as big a user of the drainage system as any of us as farmers or municipalities across Ontario.
Thank you. And switch, possibly the minute I have left, Mr. Subkowicz from the Western Grain Elevators Association. We're going to hear from the railways in the next week or so, and the railways are probably going to say that extended interswitching makes these supply chains less efficient, or possibly directs more grain to the U.S. driving you. Can you help address those issues, because we're about to hear that from them?
Absolutely. So barely any grain actually gets interswitched. So in terms of operational impacts, it's minimal. when the pilot ran from 2014 to 2017, less than 1% of all traffic was interswitched, and less than 0.6% of that was grain. So it really has a negligible to non-existent operational impact. The railways will play that up because they don't want it, because it creates some measure of competition, which is distasteful to them. So that is that is just a non-thing. The reason it's very useful to us is because the railway, if they're not providing you with a train, or they're not providing competitive rates, then you as an elevator, as a shipper would say, today you would wait for that train. You don't really have any leverage. But or I shouldn't say today, because under extended interswitching you do have some leverage, and that would be to say, well, if you're not going to provide me with that service, I'm going to avail myself to my right to connect to the competing carrier. What happens after that is the primary carrier comes back and says, okay, let's everybody just back away from the ledge. We think we can get you that train next week. So the effectiveness of extended interswitching isn't in the actual interswitch. It's in the leverage that you get in presenting the competitive alternative, in introducing that into the discussion. So that's really a non-issue. In terms of employment and trains to the U.S., I think we have to remember that both major primary carriers in Canada, they exist on both sides of the border, and they have employees on both sides of the border, and they have vast networks on both sides of the border, and they move product across the border all the time. So we don't export a lot of grain we export a lot of grain to the U.S., but the vast majority of our grain moves east-west. So it moves to one of Canada's ports for a destination overseas. So we don't move grain to or through the U.S. unless it's destined for the U.S. And in that case, it crosses the border. It can go a certain distance before the railway needs to change from a Canadian crew to a U.S. crew,
okay. and
then it moves on. So that's it really doesn't have an impact on Canadian jobs either, other than the railways will have to.
I apologize. We've got Mr. Lewis. You've got 2 extra minutes there that you'll have to send me a Christmas card, and I like good Scotch, so you can send that in the mail too. Monsieur Parent, 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Perron for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Levasseur, I'd like to hear you on the interswitching. It's something that's quite important in the West. Is this something that is important in Quebec, that 160 kilometers? No, if I understand correctly, we don't have this issue in Quebec. I think it's because we have a different access to ports, and therefore I don't think it's really an issue in Quebec. To the other witnesses, maybe one of you would like to share some thoughts. On interswitching, the law said 30 kilometers. The pilot project says 160 kilometers. Everyone says it's working well, but now there are people asking for 500 kilometers. Between 160 and 500 kilometers, it's quite a big difference. I'm not trying to angle for anything, but I'm just trying to understand, why so much space? Why 500 kilometers? Can't we have 160 kilometers and then have maybe some exceptional measures for some farmers at 500 kilometers? I'd like to hear your thoughts.
So, like in Quebec, interswitching isn't a big issue for our members across Ontario. We have very good access to ports, to the Port of Hamilton, to the Port of Thunder Bay, and others around the province. And we have a good ability to move our products. But we certainly support some of the challenges that our Western friends are facing when it comes to interswitching, and support the extended project up to 500 kilometers.
Monsieur Sobkovich, peut-être, ou Monsieur Yuvza après?
Mr. Sokovich and then Mr. Yuza?
Yes. So today, extended interswitching applies in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. So it's still 30 kilometers for the rest of the country. And the reason why we're saying 500 kilometers is because there are some elevators and some farmers in those areas that won't have access to an elevator that has that competitive alternative. So right now, 92% of the elevators have access under under 160 kilometers. It doesn't take into account the grain growing regions in BC. So those elevators are at a competitive disadvantage. And the Carrot River region in Saskatchewan is at a competitive disadvantage. In order to capture those, 500 kilometers would be needed.
Merci beaucoup. Maintenant, Monsieur Boulris, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. On to Mr. Boulris for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to get back to the cost of renovations and updates to the railway crossings. What I understand is that there's no money left in that program. So right now we're faced with 3 options. Either we reinvest in the program, or you get an exemption. You're not obliged to undertake these updates. Or third, the railway companies incur the costs. Which one of these options do you prefer, or do you want all 3 options available to you? I imagine that the one you would prefer is for the railway companies to pay. Of course, here's the issue. The program is not just for farmers, it's also for the municipality and all of society. So that program is important to have in place. There will always be updates and work to be done on those railway crossings, whether it's public or private property. So I do think that that's important. And so it's important to have that program in place and to reinvest in it. Of course, we are unlikely to have enough time to complete the required work by the end of the month. And that is why we are asking for exemptions in order to be able to do something quickly at lower cost for farmers, and that way we can address that the requirements. So exemptions are also important. But I do think that there's an issue here where we must analyze and evaluate the risk difference between railway crossings in an urban setting or on farmland and that are in private sectors. There's very little access for the general public, or not at all, and they are not used very often. And so I do think that there is a way to find a balance and make sure that that regulation is not just a blanket requirement of everyone, because the risks are not the same.
The first thing is we want to make sure that these crossings aren't closed and pulled out of the ability for farmers to use. That's, I think, a quick fix before the end of this month, that maybe we could issue that directive or what have you. Following up on that, we want to make sure that the railway's responsibility is enforced. We want to make sure that these long-standing agreements are honored, and maybe we look at legislative amendments to prevent the shifting of these costs from the railways to farmers and others.
Okay, thank you very much. Colleagues, we're going to go to the third round, so 5 minutes with the Conservatives, 5 minutes for our Liberals, and then we will still have about 15 minutes. I'll kind of maybe do a quick little round, 2-3 minutes each party, just to try to round us up to 10. I know I have a few questions. I always get jealous. You guys get to engage. It looks like Mr. Steinley is ready to rock and roll for 5 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Yuzwa, is there any other way to get your product to market other than railways?
Thanks. Yeah, that's the challenge. We don't have a Mississippi River running through the U.S. that the Army pays to dredge. So absolutely, that is a very valid question. I don't think we're going to build new railways across the country. So we need to find innovative ways to introduce competition. We also have to remember who's the customer. Usually the party that pays the bill is the customer, and we often feel it's the other way around, the way we're being treated.
And I know our beautiful province is vast, but for some of our other members here on the committee, could you tell us how far your commodities have to actually travel to get to port? Because I don't think some of our other colleagues on the committee realize how vast the distance is in Saskatchewan. And the Carrot River is a beautiful place and good fishing. I saw you caught a beautiful walleye there, but how much does your commodities have to travel?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm only about 20 miles from Carrot River, where I actually farm, and I do enjoy walleye fishing. But yeah, we're talking about 4,000 kilometers. And let's also remember the vastness of the production size. We export typical farmers in the West export 80 to 90% of what we produce. I think those numbers are substantially smaller in Ontario and Quebec, where so much more of it finds a domestic home. So that is a big thing, and we're like 4,000 kilometers to get to Vancouver, so it's a very real cost for us.
So when you put it into perspective, 500 kilometers compared to the 4,000, it makes it seem a lot more reasonable than maybe some people would realize how big those distances are. Are you aware of the APAS report that came out probably about 5 months ago, and how much Saskatchewan producers are paying the railways in carbon tax? Because I recently heard my Liberal colleague talk about how much $600,000 would be a big hit to farmers. Do you know how much farmers are paying just to the railways in carbon tax last year, and how much you're expected to pay this year?
I can't give you that number off the top of my head. You probably know the answer.
Yeah, I can give it to you, Terry. So last year, the carbon tax charge for Saskatchewan farmers was $36 million, and this year is expected to be $57 million. That's a $21 million increase. And the interesting part is this fee isn't hidden. This fee is a surcharge that the railways have on their bill to the farmers. So if they would get this money back in their pockets, how much could the farmers use that extra $57 million that is being taken just because of the NDP Liberal carbon tax?
All of these taxes are just increases to our cost of production, and it's diminished returns. Eventually, we're not viable, and we have the most sustainable crops that are out there. So it's very challenging. Paying carbon tax is not certainly not a way that is effectively improving the environment, and it's just not working. Some other country will fill that gap when we're talking about energy reduction. It's just raising our costs, it's not improving our bottom lines, and it's not preparing us for the future. We have other places to spend our capital.
And I would assume that you're trying to be as fuel efficient as possible on your farm. How much do you guys farm right now?
So our farm is 3,500 acres. We moved to direct seeding and GPS, precision planting. We have to find ways to be more productive, and we've contributed. And, agriculture and forests are a sink. They're sequestering carbon, and we're not getting paid for it. It's very frustrating dealing with this environment when your contributions are not being adequately recognized.
And that was my final question. You kind of led me there. How much have you got back in carbon rebates, or over the last couple of years? There seems to be some confusion, and some people say people are getting more back in the rebates than they're actually paying. Could you kind of lay that out there? Where we are as a 3,500 acre family farm, how much have you gotten back in rebates?
Well, the farm doesn't get carbon rebates. The individual gets carbon rebates. So those costs are in the price you pay for the product, and they're not factored into those rebates, and that's another very frustrating file. Obviously not a fan of carbon tax. It just increases costs and doesn't improve the environment.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, we'll go to Miss Murray for up to 5 minutes. One thing I do want to say, Mr. Hughes, did you say Nipawin? Is that where you're at? The home of the Hawks, right?
Yes,
yeah, I know.
Home of the Hawks are not having a good year there.
No? Okay. Well, Miss Murray, over to you for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to ask questions. I do want to say that a price on carbon is an important way to reduce Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. Has to be designed effectively, and I believe that there is ongoing work on that. But so far, Canada's price on pollution has had the result of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions here in Canada below what they would otherwise have been and below what they used to be. So we have to do that, but we always appreciate input from industry and from others as to how to do this as skillfully as possible so that it does not put unnecessary burden on any one entity. But we have to have a price on carbon. We welcome your input on how. But the question that I wanted to talk about or ask about was the fact that the railways have been saying that the interswitching, if there was extended interswitching distances, that would actually lead to delays that would cost the shippers and the farmers, and so that it would undermine the cost effectiveness of shipping. And I just wonder from each of the witnesses, do you have you factored that in? Do you agree with that? How might that work? This is something. I'm just looking at where we have that information, but they're saying that it would actually risk slowing the supply chain down, and that would be negative for the producers. What's your response to that?
I can speak to that if
The
you'd
existing
like.
program has not slowed down or caused problems. And if you were a monopoly, would you work to preserve your monopoly?
Sokovich, I know
Precisely.
you were jumping in.
So,
Sorry,
Yeah,
I was
go
just
ahead.
going to add to that. It's been a common practice since the early 1900s, and the railways are experts at managing the complexity of rail operations and working collaboratively to interswitch efficiently. They do it all the time in Vancouver. CN switches from the North Shore to the South Shore. CP switches to the North Shore. It's Canada should have full confidence that railways will be incentivized enough through competitive forces to apply creativity to resolve any operational challenges that may arise. But as I said before, less than 1% of the traffic is actually interswitched. So, you go to, whether it's at 160 kilometers or 500 kilometers, you're still only talking about one interswitch that rarely gets used.
So I would like to hear your thoughts about whether the extension to 500 kilometers would change the responses. There's been a pilot project on interswitching for 150 kilometers, I believe. So do you see a risk of slowing down supply chains with a 500 kilometer interswitching maximum? And do you think that there should be a pilot project on that larger amount? So to anyone who has information about that, I'm interested in your answer.
Yeah, as I mentioned, 92% of the elevators right now have access to an interchange at 160 kilometers. So we're talking about adding 8% of the elevators in Western Canada with the extension to 500 kilometers. So and as I mentioned, it's rarely used. So there isn't going to be an operational impact. It'll be non-existent at 500 kilometers. There's no need for a pilot project on it. It should be made permanent at 500 kilometers.
Well, I'm all for the Peace River farmers having access to interswitching as well. So I think those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Murray. Well, now, colleagues, we've got a little bit of time. I'm going to just do 2.5 minutes for each party, and I might take a little minute at the end to ask a few questions. But Ms. Rood, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. We know in Ontario there's more than 45,000 kilometres of drainage services, 2 million hectares of cropland, and it's necessary to maintain that drainage and remove excess water to prevent nutrient loss and soil degradation. And I have municipalities in my own riding who are experiencing significant issues with drainage maintenance. We know the railways are obliged to make the payments to assist in those efforts, but I'm wondering why railways like CN are not following the laws and complying with payments, and you kind of heard that from you earlier, what the cost estimate burden is on our municipalities and farmers, and what can be done to make them comply and prevent them from passing these costs on to consumers. And we've heard most of those answers, but I'm just curious, if the carbon tax was scrapped, would the railways have the money to pay for the drainage issues in Ontario?
I think you might have to ask the railway companies their opinion on whether if their costs were lowered, they'd be able to cover those costs. But my expectation is that they'd still be looking to shift a lot of these costs on drainage and private crossings to other people, whether that be municipalities or the people that use them. Like I said, these are long-standing agreements. We want to make sure they're honored. We would like to see legislative amendments to make sure they do so. And I think we've covered off most of the issues. But these are exorbitant costs that are potentially being passed on to farmers, to municipalities as well. The railway runs every day. We want to make sure that they're adequately maintaining the railways. We want to make sure that safety is upheld and agreed upon, but those costs need to be covered by the system, the railway system itself.
Thank you, Ms. Root. Ms. Taylor-Roy for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. It seems like the real issue here, of course, is the imbalance of power between the railways, which in some cases have a monopoly, and the farmers. But I did have a couple of specific questions based on testimony so far. Mr. Yuzwa, you mentioned, you stated that the price on pollution program has had no impact. Are you an expert or in this field? Do you have any, what research have you done, or what do you base that on?
I believe you need a carrot rather than a stick in order to incentivize and prepare for the future. The other reality is that we shift. It was worded today. Canada may have lowered, but the rest, a more polluting.
Okay, I understand your opinions on this. I'm sorry. I was trying to understand. You're here as an expert witness, and I was just trying to understand your expertise in gauging the impact of climate policies on the environment. And I know there's a lot of, rumors or a lot of shared beliefs about this, but I just wanted to ascertain that you, in fact, have not done research, or that you do not have any basis other than, your beliefs that this is something that doesn't work, because we have seen emissions go down by 8%, and we do have 300 experts in climate science and economics that have shown that this is one of the most effective ways to reduce pollution. So, but on another front, I was actually wondering on the price on pollution, which we're talking about, 93% of farm fuels are exempt from the carbon levy. Do you know how much of your fuels are actually taxed, and what your carbon tax would be compared to your overall expenses?
I thought we were here to talk about opportunities to improve the railway system.
Oh, I'm sorry. You've brought up carbon pricing earlier, so I was just following up on that line of questioning. That's fine then. So perhaps then you could talk a little bit about the railways themselves have been incredibly profitable. We see CN had a profit of $5.43 billion last year, and CP $3.54 billion. So they have the resources needed. And the question here is whether or not they're using them to do what needs to be done to support the farmers and to support basically the initiatives to impact climate change. Do you feel that the railways could be doing more to help the situation of farmers when it comes to these crossings and drainage and other things? Or do you think it is because they don't have enough money and the price on pollution is actually making it very difficult for them?
So we are at time. I'd ask just a brief response if the question was for Mr. I apologize. I didn't see who the question was for, but just whoever wants to answer.
Mr. Sopwich, perhaps.
Okay. Just quickly, if you could, Mr. Sankovich, yeah.
Yeah, so you're right that the railways are incredibly profitable, but that doesn't stop them from trying to pass on as many costs as possible to the shippers and to farmers and that sort of thing. And I think that's a little bit of what's happening here, and that's what we need to keep in mind. And that's why we need to do what we can to make amendments to the Transportation Act to rebalance that relationship between railways and users by whatever means we can. And extended interswitching is one of them, but there are other ways to do that. And I think that that takes some exploration.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So government regulation is necessary to help the free market system here to work for farmers.
Perfect. Thank you. Monsieur Drouin, Monsieur Perron, 2 minutes.
Mr. Perron for 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sokovich, I'd like to ask you a question. You mentioned something about the 500 kilometers earlier, and I'd like some clarification. So 8% of farmers would be added. How do you explain the fact that this would be more easily passed on to the government, and so we could not be able to impose 500 kilometers everywhere? So maybe have 160 kilometers as the general rule and then exemptions of 500 kilometers. Do you think that that would mean that it's more easily tableable for the government?
It could be. I mean, I think there could be something in there that carves out, with GPS coordinates or something, the BC area, the grain growing regions of BC, and then the Carrot River region, any place where there isn't where an elevator within 160 kilometers doesn't have access to an interchange. That's for grain. But we know that there are other sectors that this doesn't just apply to grain, and there are other sectors that, like mining and forest products, that also have the same struggles that we have with the railways, where 500 kilometers would do them good as well. So, speaking for the grain industry, I think that maybe there's a solution there, but I think it's also important to consider the question in the context of other sectors.
Je vous remercie beaucoup. Monsieur Yuvza.
Thank you. Mr. Yuzwa, same question.
I concur with what Wade said, and we just need to find innovative ways to increase competition and allow it to occur.
Et à vous deux, on a parlé,
And to both of you, we did, the debate kind of went on to the carbon tax, but there is a bill right now, C-234, that is at the House on grain drying. What would be your message to the MPs who are present here if we were to pass this tomorrow morning in the House, for example, especially those who are impeding this bill from passing? What would be your message?
We don't dry grain because we want to dry grain. We dry grain because we have to dry grain in order to ensure its quality. So paying tax on the fuel we burn to improve the quality of the grain so that it has a sellable home and isn't destroyed because it's inadequate doesn't make a lot of sense.
Thank you, Monsieur Parent. Monsieur Boulris, c'est to vous. Okay.
Mr. Boulris, if you'd like 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 2.5 minutes. There are 4 of you, and I would like to maybe take a step back from the question at hand to talk about something that's a lot more current. We have a future American president who said he will impose tariffs on everything. What do you foresee for your sector? What are the impacts that you foresee, and what would you like your government to do for you?
Well, no doubt there's potentially challenges ahead on some of our trade issues that we see across agriculture, but we want to make sure that ultimately our entire agriculture sector is supported, that we can continue the trading relationship that we have with the United States. Obviously, some of that is out of our hands, but we'd like to see our negotiators and the folks within government move forward with a balanced trade position that supports agriculture, all sectors of agriculture, and that our whole entire sector can continue to grow and be prosperous, and our farmers can continue to move forward.
CUSMA is a very successful trading relationship, and the supply chains are deeply interwoven. So, fully encourage our government's employees that have been working on this to fully do everything they can to keep it functioning and in the interests of both countries, all 3 countries.
Je pense que mes collègues l'ont bien dit.
I think my colleagues said it pretty well. The supply chain between both countries is very much related and dependent on one another. So both Americans and Canadians have to make sure that trade agreements work well and go along smoothly. I hope that the Government of Canada will respect its commitments towards the agricultural sector and ensures that there's protection of everything we've earned. They should make as many efforts possible to make sure that we have access to the American market.
Just first of all, to the OFA, do you have an estimate on what the railroads would normally contribute to the drainage system? Like, obviously, what I'm hearing from you, Mr. Spolstra and Mr. Bent, is they're kind of pulling out over the last number of years and not trying to contribute. You mentioned lawsuits. Does the OFA have even a broad estimate of what we're talking about in terms of the railroad's contribution to that system?
Thanks for the question. We don't have an estimate, but it kind of is precedent setting. So the way the Drainage Act works, if there is drainage works that has to occur through a municipal drain, then there's an assessment based on the area that is drained by each parcel, and that's the cost. So it's when those works are being undertaken that there may be an assessment that the railway has chosen to play the federal card.
And just quickly, because I don't want to push my my colleagues' time too far, but do you have a sense of what the apportionment normally is? Would it be, I guess it would depend on the project, but is it 30 to 50, 70? I guess it would just depend on how's that generally evaluated in terms of what the railway's contribution to an overall project on a percentage basis would be?
It would be based on how much land they're draining into it. The other issue would be as if, for instance, the work involved a culvert under the railway, which is a separate matter than costs.
Just quickly, one of the points that you're making is about kind of essentially shrining in federal legislation, which I understand from your testimony used to exist under the Railways Act that does no longer exist in the Transportation Act. Obviously, as you mentioned and has been testified, Ontario has a long history on this. ChatGPT quickly tells me that there is some other types of drainage acts similar across in other jurisdictions. Would you be asking for something that is specific to Ontario, or is this broader in terms of when you talk about provincial legislation? Because is OFA's position just to really protect that existing relationship in Ontario? Because we haven't heard this in many other instances elsewhere in the country.
Thanks for the question. And it certainly would be related to provincial drainage legislation, so not specific to Ontario. And really, the amendment, a possible amendment, would basically give the Canada Transportation Agency direction to consider provincial drainage legislation when they make decisions.
Just lastly, I know Mr. Steinley talked about carbon pricing. We may share a slightly different view. I mean, I've submitted in the House before that if we are serious about reducing emissions, there's no free lunch to do it. Either you're going to regulate the activity, which sometimes those compliant costs are passed off to consumers. You can have a pricing mechanism, which I sometimes tease my Tory colleagues. It's actually inherently the most conservative way to do it in the market. Or you can actually subsidize the activity, but it's going to come out of taxpayers' dollars one way or the other. So, I mean, there is different ways to look at this. But one of the things that I think is a fair conversation to have is how the railroads are able to pass that off to shippers. And so, Mr. Sokovich, my question to you, Mr. Steinley gave us numbers about what that cost actually represents, I guess, either to farmers or to shippers. The premise of a carbon price is to incentivize change behavior. If the entirety of that cost is being passed off with no provision for it to actually be kind of a true cost to the railroads to try to get them to incentivize change behavior to reduce emissions, which I would agree with Ms. Murray, it is having an impact beneficially in the country in terms of reduction of emissions. But in terms of the equity of how that is applied, I was surprised that I didn't hear you talk about this. Is this something that the Western Grain Elevator Association would like to see? Would be some type of a limit of the entirety of the carbon price that can be passed off to your shippers? Because Mr. Steinley makes the assertion it's 100%. I've heard from APAS. They suggest it's the same. What do you say?
Yeah, we support those comments for sure. We don't have a precise recommendation because, of course, it comes to us in terms of freight rates, and then we take those freight rates and we put it in the cost that we offer to the farmer. So it's a bit of a flow through for us in most cases, although some of it gets absorbed by grain companies. But I think the main point is that we're price takers on the global stage. So it's not as though you can go ahead and charge your customer for this extra cost. It's something that goes into your ability to compete internationally, and then if you can't compete, then you can't extract as many foreign dollars.
I understand all that, Mr. Sokovich. I understand that comment. What I'm trying to understand is your assertion to this committee that the 100% of what CN may pay in carbon pricing is passed off to your membership?
Yes.
Okay, and so you would support some type of legislative scheme that would actually limit the ability to allow that to happen in terms of saying, look, maybe it's only 50% because the railroad should actually bear some of this responsibility. My question to you is, if we as parliamentarians were to do something like that, would the railroads just be able to shift that cost that they may be accumulating in other fashions, or is it so legislated that you would be protected in that sense?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't fully know the answer. I mean, for the grain industry, we have something called the maximum revenue entitlement that governs the amount railways can charge for regulated grain. So there may be a better ability to police that for grain than there would be for other sectors. You know, I mean, I think that the railways are very creative in finding ways to extract their pound of flesh, you know, when you put in place rules and regulations regarding pricing. So, you know, I think they would probably figure out a way to get that back, but, you know, definitely supportive of our industry colleagues on their positions on that subject.
I think the committee would benefit from a formal position, if you have one in the days ahead, about whether or not that's a recommendation we could pass off to our Minister of Transport. Colleagues, thank you for the indulgence.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Epp.
Yeah, just in your response, or in response to your question of the witnesses, for the benefit of the committee, there's a letter sent in April of 2023 to the Minister of Transport that actually outlined the costs that the municipalities are bearing with response from the railways, and it was from the Township of Perth East in response to an Association of Ontario Municipalities of Ontario survey. 60 municipalities responded. 48% had drains across their lands with railways. Unpaid maintenance, now this is spring of 2023, was 500,000. Unpaid capital construction was approximately $1 million, and about $2.7 million of projects and upgrades were being delayed because of the position of the railways. Now that's now a year and a half ago, so those figures would be low. I can table this with the committee.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, and I think it's important. Obviously, as has been mentioned, there's a legal case going in relation to that, but some certainty between provincial or federal legislation would be important. Thank you so much to our witnesses. On behalf of all my colleagues, thank you for your work in the agriculture sector. Thank you for helping to contribute to this study. Colleagues, I will say that, of course, when we're back, we do have representatives coming from the two major railroads and the Railroad Association of Canada, so it will be important to engage with them as well. Hope you will enjoy your break week with your constituents. Oh, the other piece that I'm asked to ask is the parties to provide witnesses in relation to the study that we'll be undertaking around the protection of agricultural land. So if your party has not contributed witnesses to the clerk, please do so as quick as possible so we can be in a good position. Meeting adjourned. We'll see you in a couple weeks.